Okay. Oh, look, we've got folks coming in. Perfect. I will go ahead and kick us off. So thank you so much to everyone for tuning in for the August office hours for Fullcast customers. The topic this month is From Kickoff to Cutover, your annual planning playbook. So the season is going to be upon us soon if it's not already. So we wanted to kind of start getting everybody in the mood, I guess, for starting the annual planning season with this webinar. So the topics here are familiar from the communications you've seen in advance. So we'll talk about 4 main pillars to annual planning that are kind of aligning with the major phases: the foundation, the motion, the go live, and the follow through. We'll get into those topics one by one throughout the course of the session. A quick little housekeeping on the format. I will keep an eye on the Q&A at all times, so do feel free to drop in questions as they come up, and I will tee those off to the team. And I will record, or I'll send the recording via email tomorrow, and also a set of resources that complements the topics and best practices we'll be discussing today. So look for that in your inbox. I'll do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then I'll hand it off to them to really get into the meat of the session today. So 4 folks here from the Fullcast team, and they're all bringing a slightly different perspective to the conversation. I wanted to make sure that we get a 360 view on this process that is a very, very collaborative one. So you'll see here we've got Marisa Reed, who is on the implementation side of the house at Fullcast, has a long RevOps history. Heather Warren in the same team there with Marisa. We've got Tyler Simons, our Director of Product, bringing lots of experience with this area, as well as nice insights into Fullcast itself. And then Pete Shelton, our Chief Revenue Officer, representing for the sales leadership aspect of things. So I'll let each of them do a quick introduction of themselves as well, starting with Marisa, and then I guess we'll go clockwise.
Sure. So I'm Marisa Reed. I'm the implementation manager here at Fullcast, and previously in prior lives, I was also a senior director of sales and marketing ops. So I've kind of been through the planning cycle quite a bit extensively in my past. And conversely enough, I actually supported Pete. So Pete and I have been through the process of planning together a few times as well. So
Tyler.
Heather, you should go.
Okay,
I'm going to go next. Yeah, I'm Heather. So I have been at Fullcast for just shy of a year now. And prior to that, I had a fairly lengthy tenure working in revenue operations, primarily with RevOps data and systems. So a lot of supporting the planning of fiscal year cutovers. Even had the pleasure of being a Fullcast customer prior to joining. So I remember working with Tyler to implement new strategies for our fiscal year cutovers too.
And I will go next. So Tyler, some of the names I recognize. Hello to all of you that I know. And there are some new names that I do see. So I am our Director of Product, and prior to moving into this role, I was on the CS team and working with all of our customers on the implementations, go-to-market planning, setting quotas, all of the things that encompass the annual planning cycle. And I was doing that for about 6-7 years. So I've got quite a bit of experience across a range of different company sizes. And so I'll be here kind of guiding us through the conversation today. And last but not least, or best for last, Pete.
Yeah, thank you. I'll make it brief. Obviously been through a lot of planning cycles across multiple companies. Probably the most illuminating piece before I joined Fullcast to lead sales here was running a pretty complicated sales organization at a software company. Did a couple planning cycles without Fullcast. And then the last planning cycle, which was a pretty major change, we had Fullcast. And so for me, that was really helpful to understand just the sales and revenue operations partnership as you're trying to make some pretty big decisions and understand the outcome. And then I obviously use Fullcast for my team here, and in 6 short months made quite a few changes to go to market, knowing that knowing that it's pretty easy to model and then put in place. So that's my background.
Okay, so let's get started. We had actually originally the name of this slide was all about data, so foundation, data readiness. But what was interesting in kind of having a conversation before our conversation today, what we discovered is really the foundation actually starts with the CRO, right? What is the ultimate strategy that we're thinking about in the annual planning process? And I think, or for next fiscal year, when we think about aligning kind of all of our resources that go into next year. And so as we think about kind of what that strategy is, that does inform, okay, well, what sort of data do we need to support that strategy? So Pete, I'm going to start with you, and kind of as we think about the foundation of what we want to lay for our whole annual planning process, when you think about kind of understanding, how has the year kind of laid out and how do you want to change things? Are there certain questions that you're asking yourself, or processes that you're kind of like, okay, well, this is how we're going to go to market and how I'm going to work with RevOps in the go-to-market planning cycle?
Yeah, the data that everybody has that matters, right, is account data like ARR. Our customers know the size of their accounts and the products that they've purchased, and so that's easy. The piece that I'm seeing a lot of companies struggle with, and some have gotten it right, is any type of an account score. That's such a nice metric to balance on if you have some kind of score and you can determine how to balance on that. It's not an easy problem to solve. Some companies are pretty mature, but even if you start with something, any type of account score, and then when you're prioritizing, it's with the ARR, and maybe you're trying to minimize the disruption of accounts by still keeping the account score semi-even, or you want a new rep to have lower, a little lower opportunity than some of your senior reps, and you measure that with account score and not just ARR. That's the one I'm seeing where a lot of companies are trying to figure it out. And it's really helpful when it's in place. And maybe everyone on this call has it, but I'm noticing like maybe 1 in 5 companies are really leaning in on the account score, and everyone wants to.
Yeah. I want to put a pin in that and come back to that, because it would be good to get Marisa and Heather's perspective on kind of going into the account score. But I do, what's interesting to me is what we see kind of like year over year is there's this progression around, I'm trying to think of a good example of this, is like we've had enterprise, mid-market, SMB kind of running for multiple years, and then what we've started to see is there's like maybe some like a gut feel or like a specific industry that's done really, really well this year, right? Like we were kind of starting to see this, and we're starting to look at that data. And then as you think about, having that conversation with the sales leaders on, what's doing really well, and do we have to break out into another vertical or maybe split up our segmentation more? Do those conversations happen right now? Is that more of like a year-round thing? And I kind of like look at this as like you are kind of leading the charge on the strategy, and RevOps is kind of working with you on the data front side to support that annual planning process. But like, how does that look? Is that like that year-round thing, or are you kind of getting into this at this phase, July, August, to understand, well, do we break out an industry or, change up our segmentation structure? This is for you, Pete, by the way.
Oh,
I'm more
I
interested
apologize.
in
I
how
actually
you're
thought that was
thinking
for
about
the entire audience. No, this is the exact time that in this part of the year, this exact time that those decisions, those ideas are coming to surface. In other words, do we need to? The big one I'm hearing a lot is, do we need to take a lot of my hunters and make them farmers so that we protect our book of business? Okay, what's that going to look like? How do I now take those books of business and divide them out to more people? The industry stuff is very interesting, right? Like, either a product's doing really well or an industry's doing really well. Usually that data is really good in Salesforce, to the point where you can do a pretty quick model on what happens if I did strip these 2,000 high-tech accounts out. What's the team look like that's going to have it? What would their ARR be, their account score, if that exists? I'm seeing a lot of product specialist roles being created where a product's doing really well, and you don't want to move a rep over to it, but you want to have some form of an overlay, pretty common, right? But it's a less expensive way to really put that skill set in place. What the last thing I'll say is what's fascinating, and I watched this play out multiple times, where we go to sales leaders and say, hey, we're thinking about creating a new team. And whether that team's going to still be in the sales leader's org or not, either way, if you ask the sales leader, let's build some books of business, and what accounts would you move over to this new role? You end up with some dead books of business. At least that's been my experience. Even if they believe they're going to keep those accounts in their org, they still don't want to disrupt their reps. And so you end up with this really weird situation where either RevOps has to put some rules in place of how you distribute your accounts, or you put the model in place. But that the decision of what to do is not the hard part. It's now, how do I actually assemble these books of business or give them their territory in a way where I'm not setting people up to fail with a dead territory or a dead book of business, and I don't have somebody with way too much, obviously.
Yeah. Now, Marisa, Heather, this is kind of where the expertise and the RevOps comes into play. Like, how do we support that, right? How do we avoid these situations with some of the data quality and the data readiness that we start to think about this time of year?
So there's a lot you can do for that. No, I mean, I think you have to be doing almost like there's like a postmortem that has to happen from what your process was last year. So after you go through a planning cycle, you've carved, you've gone live with the fiscal year. You should be kind of monitoring that those territories over time, like say over the next 6 months or so. It'd be great if you have Fullcast and you're using Fullcast regularly to also be able to pull like an analysis of how much pinned you have versus not. So you can get a sense of how well your carving process went just based on the data you have. Because chances are, if your data was off, you're doing a lot of manual moves to support the stuff that just couldn't work in the rules. And those are great ways to pinpoint like where you kind of missed a little bit with the data cleanup and like some of your data directives before you went into your planning cycle last year. And so that's a good place to start, is understanding that cycle that happened the previous year, because then you're walking into those conversations with people like Pete and you're having that conversation with them during the planning cycle to say, okay, if our strategy is to leverage these pieces, let's go in and let's do a much more rich analysis of that data set in our system currently and figure out what we need to leverage to clean it up. Maybe it's if it's internal data, like how do we support a cleanup effort around there? Is there a way we can append more data from outside sources? What's the cost associated to that? There's a lot that goes into that planning. And I feel like that part is often not baked into the timeline of the planning cycle. So that piece for me is like a huge chunk of time frame that just doesn't usually get accommodated.
Definitely agree. Yeah. And an analysis like that is usually best done shortly after, rather than, we're about to start planning for this next year. Let's look back on last year.
Yeah.
I'll also add, coming from a data and systems perspectives, the first thing that I want to hear when I hear people say, what went well or that didn't go well, define that. I want to know the data and the numbers that you're looking at that tell us that it didn't go well, because that will be really illuminating going into the next planning season. That's the data that we want to make sure we have squared up, accurate, usable, and ready to be, operating with during our next planning session. Or, is it felt like, and we need to go find data because that's what was missing. That's what we needed to be making our decisions based on.
And a great example, that account score piece that Pete was talking about earlier, there's usually a formula that's usually formulaic, right? It's all of these other pieces of data are influencing an account score. Well, what's the completeness and the accuracy of all those pieces of data? Because if they're not there, you're not getting an accurate account score to use.
Yeah, I'm sure you're all too familiar, Marisa, with me demanding that they are also regularly called to task. You know, we implement an account score, and that's exciting and great, and it's helpful to be prioritizing, but if we let it go stale, if we are not keeping it up to date with additional trends or pieces of data that we now can be tracking, things like utilization, who knows what could be even more impactful. So pre-setting times, maybe quarterly or annually, where we do another analysis, we make sure that those scores were predictive or helpful and find where there may have been gaps and refine as we go, just like you would with a lead score.
Okay.
Is there a minimum that we would start with on an account score? What if I didn't have an account score?
Well,
You start somewhere.
You
Yeah.
start sort of understanding what is your ICP, like what is your ideal customer look like, right? Because then you've got demographic data that you're, and firmographic information that you're pushing into that score, but also behaviorally, like, are there other indicators that influence the score? It can be very different for different industries and different folks. Like there's,
I
go
would
ahead,
always,
Heather.
I would always recommend, actually, having done this before, when implementing something like a health score, actually that's the right time to first do a deep analysis. Go through what types of accounts typically, what are we looking through? They make it through pipeline at a higher conversion rate. They have a longer lifetime value when they do, you know, eventually onboard. Do a deep analysis. And that can be your starting point. You realize, wow, actually, we would have never guessed, but if they sign up in July, they're less likely to convert. You know, and you can find things that you wouldn't have expected to find unless you did analyze the data you at least have available for now.
Make a really quick comment. I've seen situations where customer success will have a tool like Amplitude for usage data, and they'll be using it, but it won't actually, RevOps will have not ported that information in. So it's all there. And it's like an immediate, really easy account score. So you never know. Customer success a lot of times has pretty good information. And if you can tap into that, you can start building your account score based on the way that the CSM team already knows how to measure their customers and health.
I definitely have seen the siloed departments. Data is, I've seen that be a challenge. So when you can have access to some of that really rich information from the other groups, it's 100% helpful for that process.
One of the things I think, Marisa, you had kind of talked about was, you know, understanding how much things have changed from when you planned from last year. And I just was thinking about it from the product standpoint, because it's a lot of customers on here. And some of you will have this and some of you won't for this year, but something to think about next year is that when you go live with your initial plan, you can essentially clone that and keep that as an archive of, this is how we went live this fiscal year. And you kind of just lock that in place, right? You have a historical view of, this was our original go live plan. And, you know, the intention of Fullcast is for it to change throughout the year, because you're making changes to your go-to-market plan, adding territories, getting rid of territories, moving accounts around, people get, you know, leave the company, get hired, promoted, all those things happen. And then kind of at the end of the year, or kind of really what we're talking about, middle of the year, you can start to kind of run an analysis on that that kind of like snapshot plan of how much has actually changed, right? And you can kind of do this through like a disruption report to understand, okay, well, the owner was supposed to be this person of the account, and now it is this person, and, you know, kind of dig into that data to understand why. And that can kind of help you know, uncover some of the things that, well, was this a data problem? Did we just like misassign this for some reason? And really start to get you ready for the next fiscal year as we think about kind of the analysis that goes in there.
There's a question here, Tyler. I don't know if you've seen it, which I think kind of dovetails nicely with the thread that you're on now. It says, we've built reports to see the number of accounts and ARR in each territory or region. Can we also add in performance data to see how the territories are performing? That may not be included in our territory building module. So I think that Colton's asking about, can we do metrics in Fullcast that aren't necessarily things we use in territory building or to define territories, but rather to track performance of territories throughout the year?
Yeah, I think by performance, what we are referring to is, how much pipeline, how much closed won, maybe even activity, depends on kind of how you're thinking about performance and all that stuff. If it's in Salesforce, it can be pulled into Fullcast and we can build a metric on it, and then summarize that at the territory level. And so what's interesting there is that you, in your analysis, can look at the different territories that you built. Whether if you take a snapshot of it at the beginning of the year, you can look at, okay, well, this is how it performed based on, how we originally planned for it, and then versus what it is today. And then you can kind of look at, okay, well, territory 1, for example, is overperforming on a target or overperforming compared to the rest of the territories. And then that, I think, goes into what Heather was talking about, which is like doing another deeper dive into, well, why is this territory overperforming or underperforming? Is it because all of them signed up in July and that's something that typically doesn't convert, or whatever that might be, right? And I think that that's kind of the cluing in that Fullcast can provide, while you then go deeper into the data once you've get your clue to identify where the problems might lie.
One final thing on this, just to add to what Tyler was saying about taking the snapshot. When you're going into those discussions with sales leadership, no offense, Pete, and if you are trying to achieve, if you're in an organization that is trying to achieve balance, maybe you have AEs and they all have relatively the same quotas by level of AE and stuff like that. So it's not based on territory, it's more based on role. And you want to kind of look at that balance as it was, as you planned for it. And then you can do that if you take that kind of frozen snapshot, like here's what we planned for and here's how balanced it was. And then here's what it looked like at the end of the year after manual changes or pins and a lot of fluctuation comes in. And it really starts to help you paint that picture going into those discussions, those planning discussions for the next cycle. Okay, Pete, you can come out of the so it's really just more of a helping sales not make maybe not the best decisions sometimes.
Yeah, and there's a slide where I actually want to tell a quick story about that. And I think it's really the next slide when we're talking about like how we start communicating some of the changes.
Yeah,
Do you want to move on? We're kind of we've beat the data topic a little bit here.
But I mean, we could talk about the data stuff more if we want to. But
and we could spend an hour
We
just
want to.
trading war stories on the data topic.
Yeah. So Pete, why don't we hear your story here?
Yeah. So, when I look at like change management, communicating the news, like feedback loops, what works. Every culture is different, but in the last 10 years, my approach has been I start to read in my sales leaders early, and I tell them very clearly, like, this is probably going to change 5 times. And you guys know, I mean, changes are happening all the way until the last day of your fiscal. But it really, for me at least, it's really helped reduce some of the chaos. They get bought in on like the company's going here. We're going to be directionally moving there as well with them. And this is what it could mean. And this is, and I've not had a problem where they want to like know details. They know that it's all just getting read in early, and that makes them feel like part of the team. And they give me some good feedback. Hey, be careful with this. We did this 7 years ago before you were here, and it was a nightmare, and at least gives me some signal that way. So I like to read the sales leadership in and just tell them, first of all, it's got to be confidential. If you tell your sales team, you're going to cause yourself a problem. Second of all, it's probably going to change, but you get a lot of good feedback. The second part of this is, Marissa, you just called this out. Like RevOps has the ability to keep sales out of harm's way. And by that, I mean, the last big change I made, we had Fullcast that was about the territory piece was implemented, right? So that part was done. It just barely gone live. And so RevOps told me, hey, tell me the priorities you've got. So I said, I want to minimize disruption. I want to balance on our health score, which is like our account score. Lastly, I want to balance ARR and build these new teams. And they came back to me the next day and they said, if you do what you're wanting to do, you're going to actually maximize disruption. And I said, well, it's interesting. They had all the data and they showed me what it would look like. And what was interesting is they also came back with option B. And we spent 90 minutes looking at it. And it was a little bit of like just changing the priorities. And it wasn't perfectly balanced, but that was fine. It solved everything we were trying to do. But the idea I had would have been a bad idea. It seemed right, like instinctually or hypothesis. But once they actually could show me what it was going to mean and then come back with a recommendation, like that was really valuable. I know every culture is different between sales and RevOps as well, but I would say most CROs, like they're sometimes making decisions. They come off very confident, but they really don't know. It's like, I'm going to try this. You can keep them out of harm's way by saying, here's some things to consider. This could be the impact that we don't want. They're going to be all ears. At least everybody that I know loves this guidance from RevOps.
How could we, Heather, Marisa, how could we use Fullcast to kind of give those options?
You model. So you can create as many plans as you want. So when you're in that middle of that planning cycle, you model. You create another plan. You base that plan on the priorities that your sales leadership is throwing around at you. And you go to them and you show them different models with different options, like what Pete said. Like, here's what it looks like if we do it your way. But here's what it will look like if we maybe take a hybrid approach or we don't do something else. You can kind of play with it. But yeah, you can make those models. And actually, Heather has a customer who does that really well. And
Yes.
And yeah, we've talked about it before, that it's kind of fun to watch somebody embrace it and get really creative. Yeah.
I'll actually say probably one of the most successful presentations that I've been able to witness is, as we talk about priorities, first thing they did is, before going into planning, they were all aligned on priorities. And then in the presentation specifically, they even, reinforced those priorities that they went in with. And it was very interesting. They anticipated the pushback, because there's always trade-offs, right? And they went with the priorities that they had been aligned on, but because they anticipated some pushback, they came prepared with another model that showed if they had switched priorities, and showed what it would look like. And very similar to Pete's story, everyone was like, you're right, actually. We had aligned on these priorities. Minimize disruption was the most important. And so even though this isn't quite what I expected, it is the best outcome.
Now, Pete, I want to go back to something you had said real quick, which was bringing in frontline sales leaders early, right? On kind of the changes that are coming down the pipe and kind of how we're thinking about next fiscal year. Like, I am a big fan of the transparency piece of this. And a lot of that has to do with getting the buy-in. I'm just curious, as a kind of a quick question for you, because then I'll kind of tell a little story with this as well, in the sense that, how early do you see yourself bringing in sales leadership on the changes that are coming?
Yeah, and I think honestly, it does depend on when the organization starts to talk about it. The best scenario, best case that I've ever been part of, we had a full quarter, and then about a month before that. So we were in the last month of Q3, and I had a pretty good direction of and some of it at that moment, my boss at the time, who was a CRO, said, I actually want you to let the second line leaders provide feedback. We might not do this, but roll this plan out to them and then let's iterate. So they actually had a say in it a little bit. So that was a perfect world, because we had a month before Q4 started, and then that's when like the real planning meetings started. So that was 4 months in advance of the fiscal. A lot of times there's not that much, you don't have that much time. But to me, if that's possible, 4 or 5 months, perfect, best case.
And so this is the lead into my Fullcast Kool-Aid conversation for everyone, and why I love Fullcast so much and why I've been here forever. I'm never leaving. Just kidding. The really, it's the feedback loop, right? And so as we think about setting up feedback loops, it's funny, we did Ashley, what do we call those things? Fireside chats? Actually, I think there's somebody on here that was actually part of them. And we had these fireside chats, and there was multiple people that had talked about feedback loops and how important they are. And what's interesting is the tighter you can make the feedback loop, the faster you can iterate on things. And one of the things that we've seen with Fullcast, and particularly with Smart Plan for me, is how fast you can, or how tight you can make that feedback loop. And so as we think about bringing in sales leaders or revenue leaders, if you want, like, because if you think about CSMs and BDR teams and all of these teams that you have, the earlier we can bring them in, the faster we can move on feedback. And that's where Fullcast is really strong, because what I've seen with customers that coming into Fullcast for the first time is their previous planning cycles, they weren't bringing in sales leaders early enough because they were spending more time just trying to get V1 done, the initial draft of what does a territory look like? What does our plan look like? And now what we're talking about doing here with this motion is, let's not just build one go-to-market, but maybe we build out multiple go-to-market models. We sit down with sales leaders earlier rather than later to get that feedback, and we can iterate on that much faster. So we can tighten that feedback loop and ultimately get to what we call a really solid go-to-market plan for the go live. And we've also established a lot of buy-in from the larger organization. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Does anybody else have any other things they want to talk about with the kind of the motion aspect of kind of our annual planning process?
Oh, I'll just definitely reiterate, coming from ops, man, that last bullet of change management, that is so incredibly important. And it's, if you're about to go live and are just now thinking of it, you are behind the ball, right? How are we going to manage this change? How are we going to make sure no one is caught by surprise? It's key and can't be left to the last minute.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the minimized disruption conversation can be a bit scary sometimes, because sometimes to get to a more balanced view, you have got to mix up, you've got to have some disruption. So then it's sort of, how are you filtering to what you need to minimize disruption on versus what you're releasing to be able to balance by those criteria to really carve it the way you want it to. And in that case, that's where that change management also comes in, from a expectation setting, because you want to be able to show people, you want to have that ready to go. You want to be able to, when we're rolling this out, we also should have like views so people can see the kind of the kind of thinking behind the scenes that went into it. Like, we're not trying to rip things away from people. We are actually trying to achieve a balance. And being able to actually show some of that is also something that you can easily do from Fullcast.
Yep.
So.
The other part to this too, for some of the customers, maybe you have managers in Fullcast, maybe you don't, but if you don't, something to think about this year, because managers can log into Fullcast, they see what they have access to, and they can move accounts around based on whatever kind of rules or things that they've kind of see fit, based on like, oh, I want to move this account to this territory for different reasons. And so that also is another buy-in building strategy for us, is getting them involved in that process. And ops is able to kind of review, you can kind of run Smart Plan on top of those moves that have already been made, if they kind of do the named accounts or named exception approach. And so that keeps things balanced in the end. So there's some stuff there with the manager input. And then the other thing that I had kind of thought about too was reps. So we were talking about minimized disruption, and I kind of had this thought of like, you should just ask reps, like, what is it that they care about? What are the attributes of accounts that where they're going to be pissed that an account gets moved out of their name? And it's likely that there's open opportunities or they spent a ton of time working things, and we can make guesses at that, but don't just make those decisions on your own, but get the feedback, get the input. And it doesn't just have to come from managers, it can come from reps as well. And I just think that's super important. And the earlier that you start this process and kind of gather that feedback, the more time you have to incorporate that into your annual planning process. So let's talk about some of the change management stuff, because I think the next slide is really going to talk about our cutover plan, and really communication's the big one. And I think Heather, if I remember right, you were just talking about communication and being number one. And so I would just like to hear if you've got any anecdotes here or anything that's like kind of top of mind for you.
I think sometimes in planning and often, especially if we're excited for a new strategy and we're thinking, this is the work that I have in my GTM or operations role, we don't always remember all the moving pieces. And if we're not communicating these early and often to applicable teams, it can really throw a wrench in the works. We want to segment on some new data. Do we have it available in the system? Is it reliable? Have we checked to make sure that that's usable? Is that impactful? And of course, ahead of doing the go live itself, communicating these changes and getting alignment and kind of buy-in earlier would be very beneficial in preventing the "who moved my cheese" reactions, right?
And to Pete, to bring it full circle too, with when you talk about like kind of the go live motion, like that stage, if you will. To what Pete was saying earlier, you get sales managers and you kind of get them involved early, and you're getting their perspective. That's part of change management, right? So you've got those priorities from them. You've gotten that great rich feedback from them earlier in the cycle, and it's much easier later on in the cycle to say, hey, we built this plan, here's the feedback we incorporated from the reviews and everything else we did with you, and present that back to them. So it's much easier to kind of manage the change in that regard if you've started from a place of also managing the change.
I think what's really interesting is the way this is communicated. If you've read the sales leaders in, right, you're rolling out the plan for everybody. This is what's changing for the next year. And you've read the sales leaders in, we all know on this call that every sales rep's going to be texting or sending a Slack message to their leader saying, this, what are we doing? Like, why are we doing this? And sales leader can tamp all that down and say, no, this is smart. Like if that sales leader's already bought in, they'll tamp down and get the reps comfortable. It just reduces a ton of chaos with buy-in. But I do want to tell a really quick story about buy-in. And this is not applicable to everybody all the time, but it just was such a valuable lesson for me. So I was at Adobe for 7 years, from the Omniture to the full digital marketing, run up, which meant massive changes every year, lots of new reps, lots of reduced accounts and bigger quotas every single year. And what I learned was the head of RevOps, her name was Josie. She was a master at telling the story of why this is going to be better for everybody. And she would do individual with every business unit, every sales business unit. She would roll out the plan, and I could tell that she'd worked really close with the chief sales officer, but he wouldn't be on the call. It would literally be her saying, listen, like, you have more to sell this year, and this is why we're doing it. And you're all going to have more opportunity. And that's even in less accounts, even with the higher quota, you're going to have more opportunity. She was just a master at that story. And so the last 14 years since I was there, it's just top of my mind of like, what's the story and the narrative that around why this is good for the sales team, not just good for the company. And that's a lot of art, not science. And I know we're talking a lot of science today, but that art, if you can get really good at that, it's the strategy behind it and why it's good for the team, and the sales leaders buy in early, like that matters. It seems to help a lot with just getting the team to just get going in Q1. and not sit back and wait and figure out if this is where they want to be.
I mean, honestly, like I used to be a change management lead for Salesforce implementations. And the way I look at change management for this stuff is it's not the main components of change management never change, right? It's like you have to have certain things if you really want to succeed with the change management. And that is true of fiscal year planning changes as well. That buy-in, that kind of involvement in the cycle, but not also communication through the cycle. So it's not just all coming at the end. And then that final rollout and kind of tying that whole message all in together. That is kind of core change management. And it's no different in this, like with fiscal year planning, than it is for any kind of technology rollout or something, that core fundamental piece of it. I think I wanted to kind of, we've kind of like the change management is kind of is that kind of non-technical necessarily piece of it, but to also kind of talk about in the go live the more technical piece of it and why I personally see Fullcast as kind of amazing in this regard is I come from the spreadsheet kind of world where every year I had to manage the giant spreadsheet of doom that everyone has seen at some point in their career, I think. And I can say that I just personally, the first few times I really got in and started to create different plans and do that cutover from like, this is this fiscal year's plan and we are moving to the next fiscal year that we've just finished and finalized and it's beautiful and we're ready to go. That part is so much nicer when you have Fullcast, only because like you're not having to deal with the giant data loader changes, the spreadsheet craziness, the things that somehow you thought were right on the spreadsheet but then aren't later on. I feel like the management of assignments, the ability to make those quick changes and have that export happen automatically, that makes that part of the process almost like the least worrying part of my process, like rather than all the like the change management side of things. So.
That leads into the last topic really well, which is what happens after go live. You know, were the decisions right and how quick can you pivot?
What happens after? So, okay. So do we
want
have
to
any
move to this, or is there anything else for us to say with the go live? Because I agree, but I mean, Heather, do you have anything else you want to talk about with the go live process?
Yeah, just on the technical piece, following up with Marisa, definitely agree, especially if there's going to be a fairly large change from last year to this year, doing the validation checks. And I'll definitely give a plug in for some really helpful, tools that Fullcast has that can help with this. Even for those more used to those spreadsheet worlds, being able to simulate the export, see the data that's about to go before it goes and make sure that that's exactly what was expected, just lets you go forward with much more peace of mind and just knowing that exactly what was expected is what's going to end up in Salesforce for everyone tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the aftermath. Pete, I think you had a good point that you were going to bring up here, so I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, so using Fullcast this year for my team, we set a threshold for the enterprise team of an employee count, pretty basic, the most basic you can have. And about 2 months in, we started to notice that all we did is snapped in ICP, enterprise and mid-market. But what we noticed is a ton of the opportunities were coming in under the threshold for enterprise, just barely. So small enterprise, but they were falling all into the mid-market segment. And so that was an easy look at where the pipeline's coming from. But what was really nice is that when I got with Jason from Fullcast, who is my RevOps guy and keeps me out of harm's way, we just modeled what happens when you reduce the threshold for employees by 100, 200, 300, and that's where we landed. We just reduced it by 300. And that didn't really make a big, that didn't really unbalance the accounts. The accounts stayed semi-similar, but it balanced the pipeline really nicely. And so I wasn't starving the enterprise team anymore. Just really, I mean, that took 5 minutes. The other thing too is I had noticed that we had not moved the radio button for keeping parent and children together. And I had an explosion between two of my reps for an account was assigned to one rep, but the other rep handled all of a portfolio company's accounts, and that was like considered the parent. We just hadn't made that change. And so I was thinking, okay, I dealt with that issue. There's a lot of fallout from that. But then like, how many more times could this happen to me? And so got with Jason again, and he said, listen, like this could happen to you 50 more times. It was like 50 of these things sitting out there in this segment that were not associated. So we slid the radio button over, and I haven't had any more of those scenarios play out. So I think, that's my guiding principle, that worked. And we avoided a bunch of potential explosions between reps and two people thinking they have the same account. So those are things just with watching what's happening throughout the year, and Q1's hard. You've made all these changes, and if it's not perfect, you deal with it. And so it's really nice to know you can make micro changes really quick just to fine tune it.
I was just about to say, I think the key there was that you were saying it was a 5-minute change, right? Because you were in there, you were looking at things, and it wasn't looking the way you wanted it to look. And then when you immediately like went in and were able to kind of like just play with those metrics until you got it to where you wanted it to be. I mean, you're not looking at manipulating a spreadsheet again, like a bunch of times. It's literally just a metric change or a view in there, and then just shifting a criteria or two around. I think that piece of it, that postmortem, like being able to like make those quick edits that, in kind of real time is key, like honestly. And I think that's the other kind of moral of the story here is don't be afraid to make the quick edits. Like if you're trying to get to a certain place, you don't need to wait and be making a bunch of manual changes, like our manual one-off pinning. You can make those changes. It's not difficult to do that. It doesn't need to wait to another planning cycle.
Yeah, for me, this is like this is one of the reasons why you have a tool like Fullcast, and it's not just in the spreadsheets. I've always subscribed to this notion, like the old school way of doing this with the spreadsheets was you load this stuff into Salesforce, and then you just kind of let the world pass by as it is, right? You're moving accounts from one rep to another. You're not really looking at the larger picture of how things are split up or not. You're just like in the weeds. And if you take Pete's example, you're just moving accounts from one rep to another to try and balance your pipeline, but not actually looking at the segmentation rules and how I can change those. And so what that ends up being is you end up kind of having this like crazy mess of a CRM come next planning cycle. And then you're right back in this whole change management cycle of like, okay, how much do we disrupt and how do we not? But the big thing is that this plan that you do, annual planning, really is actually happening all of the time. And don't be afraid to change up the rules and change things mid-year. That's the point of having a territory tool and having a go-to-market planning tool, is to be able to make those changes and make them fast and really think about it from a larger picture standpoint, not just from I want to move an account from one rep to another. So that's certainly kind of this dealing with the after the go live, and after you're kind of starting to see this plan actually happen in real time, is iterate, make those changes, make the improvements that you need to the plan, because ultimately that agility is what leads to the success of the business. anything that people want to talk about here with system or really like processes that we've seen, like with reps reporting feedbacks, changes, or enablement, office hours, anything that we've seen that's been really successful with customers or in your tenure as a RevOps person?
Yeah, I've seen there's a customer that, especially after a fiscal year change and cutover, they track extra particularly the requests that come in for accounts to be moved from one rep to another, and they track the reasons behind those. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a spike after a fiscal year cutover, but they're watching to see, what did we miss? And it's kind of added as part of their postmortem is there anything coming up that we just failed to plan for? Maybe it was like you said, Tyler, we didn't actually ask reps which accounts they wanted to keep most, and so they wanted different accounts. But being able to see what the main cause of those account moves having to happen can really show what you might want to plan for, even as you said, after, or definitely include in next year's fiscal planning.
I think to that point too, it's nice to have like already pre-scheduled out in your plan, like some sort of like those almost postmortem like checkpoints, like after the go live, like here, we're gonna all get together and we're going to kind of check in at the stuff that we know we've put in place to track. And we're going to do that at regular intervals and just kind of figure out if it's working, if there's stuff we have to adapt. But it's nice to have that like pre-scheduled, like 30 days out, 60 days out, 90 days out.
Cool. So
I'll
we
chime
gotta
in. Okay.
Yeah,
wrap
we have a
I was
question.
gonna do the same one. Yeah.
Are you
We
gonna
got a
talk?
question.
I was actually chime in one more thing. So I used to write case studies, and I'll never forget this person told me during a case study interview that their first rollout of Fullcast, each regional ops person did open office hours where they would just come and they would have Fullcast open and reps could come and look at it. And there was this historically feuding pair of reps in Europe somewhere, noisy, just like that. And then they got on the call and they looked and they saw like, okay, this is the metrics that we balanced your territories against. This is how many accounts each of you have and why. And it fizzled off and didn't happen again. So that's really stuck with me, this idea of like, you could just open up Fullcast and have your reps look at it and be able to be very transparent in that way. And I think those types of office hours I've heard being very successful. That's my story. One story for me. And a question that you saw, Tyler. When rolling out the territories to start the year, I know Fullcast can push the new account ownership to Salesforce. Can it do a bulk unassign of all accounts from reps and then assign the accounts we have built out in our territories model? The reason I ask is there may be accounts in Salesforce assigned that are not in our Fullcast model. That was a very specific question.
So do you want to take it, Tyler, or do you want me to?
No, you're the boss. Go for it.
So yes, so there's kind of like multiple parts to this. So the way that when we cut over to a new plan or when we go live with a brand new Fullcast plan, Fullcast does send all the assignments, right? Like you do like a mass update of all those export, or I should say, of all those account team members. So when you're cutting over, you're basically like shutting off the exporting to one plan and turning it on for the other plan. And when you shut off the exporting or disable the exporting for those roles in the previous year's plan, it goes in and it cleans out all of those account team records that it created. The trick is, to your question, it's that it created. So if you're live with Fullcast, anything Fullcast has sent will clean out. But if you have accounts in there where you have that same role that was created without being in Fullcast, Fullcast won't know to clean those out. So that would have to be a cleanup process you'd want to undertake before you went ahead and did your exporting or an enablement for your new plan.
Yeah, there's a couple ways to solve for this, and I want to wrap up, but the other thing that I've seen is handled this in a flow. If it's in an unassigned node, which I know is not really the question here, but if it's in an unassigned node, put it in some temporary user, they call it like a systems user. Same thing if it doesn't have a territory because it's not in Fullcast. Assuming that it's been cleaned up, if it was in Fullcast before and you removed it out of there, and it doesn't have a territory, put it in some sort of temporary like holding user type of thing. And that's kind of the signal for it not being part of the Fullcast model. And certainly we can come up with like a million different ways. So we've got 5 minutes left. I think Ashley has some stuff that she wants to talk about. So if there are any other questions, chat them in. Was there any other parting thoughts from the other panelists today? Anything we want to like feel like this is my golden ticket?
I think we've expounded on all of the topics as best we can. I'm sure we could keep going, but I don't know if anyone wants us to. So.
I don't. No, just kidding. So thank you so much for coming. Again, if any other questions come up afterwards, feel free to reach out to anybody on the team. We'll be more than happy to help you out. Like I said, the recording and the slides will be emailed out tomorrow. We also have a resource pack that has things like, here's a request deconstructor. So you get a request from your Pete and you have a way to kind of, a framework to break that down and really kind of help him better understand the situation and make those prescriptive recommendations. And we have a few other resources in there as well that we hope will be really helpful. The other note here, the upcoming office hours. So over the next couple of months, we will be doing sessions dedicated to our targets functionality. A lot of nice changes there that folks will want to see. The reporting and dashboarding features in Fullcast, as well as our holdout policy that lets you automate the transitions typically across fiscal years. So definitely tune in for those, and we'll keep promoting those in the same ways that we have so far. That's it for me. Thank you.